And welcome back for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. You know, one of the constant topics in this COVID era is the price of real estate. Paradoxically, in this time of uncertainty, people are willing to pay unheard of sums for houses, second houses, and other property. Let's try to make sense of this by speaking with Tim Hudak. He is a former colleague of mine in the Ontario legislature and now heads up the Ontario Real Estate Association. Tim, welcome to the program.
Good to see you again, Tony. Thanks for having me on Boom and Bust. And yeah, I mean, we've worked together since 1995.
Ouch.
We're, of course, both like 15 at the time.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks for that clarification. I'd love to get, just to start us off, just your assessment of the state of real estate in Ontario right now during this COVID period. Let's hear it from the expert here.
Yeah, think of it as kind of a cruel game of musical chairs, right? There's a lot of people who are in the market, but fewer chairs out there. So they're going around in circles. It gets to be a pretty intense bidding process to get a home. So why is that happening? Well, really two reasons, Tony. There's math behind it and some psychology. And happy to talk about either of those major driving factors. But it's a good time to be a seller. It's tougher to be a buyer.
So I'm gonna get to what's driving this a little bit deeper. But you obviously are in contact with realtors all the time. How are they coping with this market?
Challenging. It's just very, very busy, and it depends on really what side of the equation you're on. I mean, home ownership has been a great investment, and you know this for your time in public life as well. You know, homeowners tend to give back to their community more. They're volunteers. Their kids do better in school and in life, all else constant. It's a great part of the Canadian culture. It's built our middle class. It's made us a strong country and the envy of the world. And more people want to become homeowners. But sadly, Tony, since 2016, that slipped. We have fewer homeowners as a percent of the population for the first time in the history of Canada. More people want to get in the market. We just don't have enough housing supply. So if you're a realtor, to answer your question, you have a listing, you're going to have people knocking down your door virtually, right, to try to get their clients into the market. If you're representing some buyers, it's pretty tough. There's a lot of frustrated buyers. And Debbie and I were like this at one point in time, too, where you had a kid on the way, you're trying to get a home, you go and make an offer on a home and you find out you lose, you go down the street somewhere else, you know, many of whom have seen a dozen or so houses pass them by. So it's pretty tough when you're a realtor because you want to help them get the keys to that new home and you end up walking away empty-handed.
Wow. And I guess I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this is beyond COVID, right? Like COVID is a part of this story, but there are also some long-term trends that you're explaining here.
Yeah, no doubt about it. So the long-term trend, I'll start there to your question, is we have more people who are trying to get into the housing space and fewer homes built. And this was a problem in Ontario, and I think other provinces as well, that occurred over years. I think governments, you know, for good purposes, are trying to protect the environment. They put a lot of process in place, but the amount of housing inventory supply in the market has not kept up with demand. The main drivers of demand, well, millennials, as you know, the biggest generation now in the history of our country, are moving into years where they're getting promotions, they're getting married, they're having kids, and they're looking to get a place to call their own. You also have a generation of their parents who have substantial savings that love their sons and daughters dearly, but kind of want them to move on and get a place, get out of the house. So that's helping to finance it. And immigration has always been a driver. So you're seeing more people on the demand side, plus low mortgage rates, but we did not build enough homes to keep pace. And as a result, homeownership is slipping away from too many people.
And we'll get to some of the policy remedies in a later segment, but we've got about just under a minute before we go to break. But this is kind of, as I said at the outset, a paradox. Like, we're in uncertain times, yet people, I guess, are deciding that real estate is where they want to be in uncertain times. Is that right?
I'll walk through more of it after the break, Tony, but that's basically it. It's always proven to be a stable, solid investment throughout the history of Canada that has given you good returns. And when you're looking at other kinds of investments, you can't live in a stock. You can't live in a bond. It's a place where raise our family. So it's near and dear to people's hearts. During COVID crisis and the drivers I mentioned earlier, they're all pushing more people to say home is a place of safety, security, smart investment, and I want in on it.
We're going to return to our conversation with Tim Hudak. He is the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Stay with us after the break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum. We're speaking with Tim Hudak. He is a former member of the Ontario Legislature, and he now heads up the Ontario Real Estate Association. Tim, I guess one of the questions, if you're an investor in real estate, it's not just your primary residence, as you mentioned, it's also a stable investment. We just heard before the broadcast that housing prices in Toronto in April took a 20% kind of correction. So what is the long-term trend? I'm assuming that that's just a course correction and that the general trend is higher prices. Is this sustainable?
So a couple of questions there. So let me talk about what's happening in the marketplace first, then we'll get back to sustainability. So what we're seeing here is a typical market response. As you cover a lot of these issues, Tony, on your show, that the market will respond to price signals. So we saw a lot of demand in the early part of this year as more people, and let's think about it, these are the COVID haves. These are the people who are fortunate to keep their jobs. They're not spending as much money on discretionary items like going out for dinner, going on vacations and such. They built up savings. They're trying to get in the housing market. There's other drivers as well. But we didn't have as much inventory. As a result, prices went up. That does a couple things in the marketplace. Number one, if I see the house down the street going for a significant higher value than I bought my home for, I might say to my wife, maybe it's time that we moved and put our house in the market. So more inventory comes in. Naturally, in the spring as well, it's the time that many families and individuals say, it's time to make a move. So more supply comes in the marketplace. And I do believe as things improve during COVID across our country, you'll see more people who are comfortable with individuals coming in their home to check it out as potential buyers. Now, our realtors have done a hell of a job in moving more of their business online. They're using electronic means for interviews, for doing virtual tours, virtual open houses. But when the rubber hits the road, you're going to make a big investment like a home. People want to see the inside of it.
Right.
So as sellers get more comfortable, Tony, I think you'll see a return to supply, which helps to balance out the market more.
So that is something as more people get vaccinated, as hopefully rates of infection go down, you think things will balance out a little bit more.
Exactly. And it's a good lesson for policymakers. I mean, you've played both federal and provincial cabinet roles, and it's important when it comes to big issues like housing, you don't make a knee-jerk reaction. You don't do something on the spur of the moment in a market that might be hot. You see what the trends are. So it's a lesson for governments not to, knee-jerk intervene in the market. It tends to balance itself out. Where they should focus their energies are the long-term trend. So back to your sort of long-term question, there's no doubt that all the indicators of low mortgage rates, the economy will improve, generational impact of millennials and immigration will be restored. We still believe that demand is going to be much greater and inventory limited. So any advice for policymakers at a provincial level, municipal, and then federal would be focus like a laser on housing supply. Give us more choice in the marketplace. That may be an intensification in big cities, and maybe building on top of transit stations in Toronto, and maybe converting brownfields or underutilized government buildings or properties in mid and small sized communities. The big issue for the long run is to make sure you have enough inventory to keep home ownership within reach.
I'm going to return to that question. I have one other curiosity question for you before we get to what government should do. Are millennials different as home buyers than previous generations, or are they basically the same?
We did something very novel. Tony, is a great question. We thought we'd actually ask millennials, and we did a poll. So I'm CEO of the Ontario Real Estate Association, as you mentioned. Our website for your viewers is orea.com. They can go there, orea.com, and we studied millennials in partnership with Ryerson University. Here's a shocking finding. Turns out millennials are people too. Despite what everybody says, they're people too.
Yeah.
They have the same preferences as their parents or grandparents did in terms of home ownership. And a similar proportion still want to have a detached home. Similar proportions still want to have a family as before. The challenge is they're slower in the market because their wages have not kept up with housing inflation. They spend longer time in school. But when we poll millennials, they had similar demands, and we'll see them now moving into the marketplace. As I said earlier, that's one of the big pressures on housing demand and prices today.
All right, we're going to return to these topics, and we're finally going to drill down on what should or would a government do. Right after the break, we're speaking with Tim Hudak. He is the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association. We'll be talking all things real estate after the break as well. Please stay with us. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Tim Hudak, former colleague of mine in the Ontario Legislature and the Ontario Cabinet, for that matter, and now head of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Tim, you started to drill down a little bit on what government should be doing. I do want to unpack that a bit because, as you mentioned, these are long-term trends, and they are connected to affordability in desirable locations, Toronto being the obvious example, but not the only example now. So first question is, did the Ontario budget, the recent Ontario budget by Peter Bethlenfalvy, was there anything in there that would speak to the affordability issue?
So it was basically an extension of the work the government has already done in Ontario on increasing housing supply. The realtors we did our homework. We worked with post-secondary institutions, and we looked deep in the market and said, okay, how can we actually impact on affordability to make sure that we can help create that next generation of Ontario homeowners? We brought that forward to all four political parties back in 2018. Doug Ford won the election. And of the 10 ideas we brought forward, they actually implemented 8 of them. It was called the More Homes, More Choices Act. Municipal Affairs Minister Steve Clark, I don't know if he's been on the show with you as of yet, but that was probably the most pro-home ownership legislation we've seen in generations. So kudos to them. But as you know, you can't build a home overnight. You wouldn't want to live in one if you could. So they're moving the things through the process, I think, appropriately to create more choice in the marketplace. So the provincial budget furthered that. We have ideas for more reforms. A couple of things they did have that will help out to your question about housing. Let's get outside of the big cities. There was a major investment of $1 billion in broadband. Interestingly, Tony, like areas that you represented in Parry Sound, Muskoka, the top question realtors now get isn't how good are the schools or what's local hospital like. It's how's the internet service.
Right.
So that funding from the province, and I believe the federal government did their own, will help bring what is really modern infrastructure to small towns across our province, and that will help increase access to housing. Another part of the provincial budget was around natural gas and extending natural gas as an option outside of urban areas. That helps bring the cost of living down. It can actually attract new manufacturers and jobs, helps the agriculture sector. So in terms of increasing housing choice and more supply in the smaller communities, the budget did a couple things we had asked for around broadband and natural gas extensions.
So I'm presuming as head of the Ontario Real Estate Association, you're kind of neutral on where people choose to live, but it's a fact that Toronto is crazily expensive, the average home price well over $1 million. Are you trying to find solutions that give people choices outside of Toronto, or are you also trying to find solutions for people inside Toronto?
Both. So I talked a bit about, the smaller communities, and demand has increased. Again, at OREA.com, you can see our public opinion surveys that there has been a shift, Tony, of preferences to suburban and rural communities. There's no doubt that a permanent change, the ability to work from home, enables people to live in the small town and report to the big city headquarters as well. So that's underlying the demand increase in those areas. But that doesn't mean Toronto's going backwards. In fact, quite the opposite. The Toronto market is also doing well. So here's some solutions we put on the table for major urban areas like Toronto or Mississauga or Ottawa. A lot of it is around intensification. The province of Ontario is appropriately, as well as the city of Toronto, investing in transit, building under the ground. But some ancient bylaws in the 1970s limit how high you can go, sometimes to 2 stories. That doesn't make sense. So intensify along those transit lines, build on top of those stations. Enabling more buildings to actually become multi-res would be very helpful as well. And a big part of cities is what we call the missing middle. You can have your really high towers, you can have your one floor, two floor homes, but in between there's a significant gap. And the so-called missing middle is important because that's often affordable for first-time home buyers and also for empty nesters who say, you know what, I still want to be near the grandkids and my kids and live in the city. I don't need the big family home. So they move into the missing middle homes and they open up that family home for a new family buyer. So those are a couple of ideas, Tony, that work. And so two things that work everywhere. I do believe government will reduce its footprint. I think the same thing happening in the commercial sector would hopefully impact government. So government is a biggest landlord actually in the city of Toronto, other communities as well. They can lower their footprint when it comes to government buildings, consolidate those, and convert some into residences as well. And opportunity zones, which have worked well in the US, in the United Kingdom, for example, maybe that's a brownfield, maybe that's an area that has high unemployment and little hope. The government could accelerate tax reductions, approvals of permits, less red tape, and build those areas up for more jobs and more housing to go along with it. Those are a few of the solutions that we put on the table.
We're going to take a brief break, but we'll be right back with Tim Hudak. Please stay with us. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, here with Tim Hudak. He is the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association. Tim, we were just talking before the break. It sounds like your association, maybe this is of necessity, but you concern yourself not only with housing affordability and sustainability. I totally get that. But you're looking at a whole suite of public policies that either incidentally or directly have an impact on home ownership. I'm thinking of broadband as an example. So is that something that's normal for you and necessary in order to represent your association?
I appreciate you asking the question. So this is a relatively new field for the Ontario Real Estate Association, but it comes about because our realtor members are very active in their communities. And you can go to any sort of local school council, the hockey team, the women's shelter, and they're realtors who are volunteering to help out those groups. So similarly, we have a role to reflect that by trying to build stronger communities. That's part of our mission statement at AREA now, to help Ontario realtors build stronger communities. So we talk not only about housing, but things that make the quality of life better. So we talk about investing in transit or better roads. We talk about how we can help mitigate flood damage in communities as well. And we talked about broadband and natural gas. But at its core, we believe fundamentally that as a Canadian strength is a culture of home ownership. That whether it was your parents that came to this country, Tony, grandparents like mine, great-grandparents, they believed in investing in a home to raise the family, and it was a smart investment. And every generation had a better chance of owning a home than the one previous until the last 5 years. We want to reverse that decline and help reinforce that important Canadian value.
And that's an interesting point. So are you also playing a role as an advocate for home ownership? Because there is this kind of counter narrative that has developed very recently saying, no, you don't need to own a home, just keep renting. That's what this generation wants and needs. So are you trying to counter that argument as well?
Absolutely. Look, a lot of us will be both in our lifetime. I mean, I started out once I moved out of home as a student, as a renter. My 20s, I was a renter. I became a homeowner. I suspect down the road, like my parents did, sell off our home for retirement, and then they moved into a rental unit. The reality is that most human beings are on elements of the spectrum. And realtors also want to make sure that the most vulnerable population also have access to shelter. So we do get involved in issues around rentals, around social housing, around homelessness. The reality is, Tony, if first-time homebuyers can't get in the market, they stay in apartments longer. And that means those in social housing who try to live in apartments get stuck there. And who pays the price of that? Our most vulnerable Canadians end up on the streets or in poor housing conditions. We'd like to help fix that. We do find that some of the arguments we hear that we should give up on homeownership are dangerous.
Mm.
Could basically roll out a lot of studies by economists that demonstrate that homeownership is vital to people reinvesting in their community as an asset to start a small business. They tend to volunteer more, get active in the neighborhood. Ultimately, do it responsibly, though. You need to make sure that if you're making the biggest purchase of your life, where you're going to put your family, your fondest memories, use the advice of a realtor. Have that professional there that can make sure you're making the right choice for you financially, and you know where that neighborhood is going and its strengths and weaknesses.
We've got just a little bit over 30 seconds left in our show. Work from home, clearly a trend. Is that something that you're also tracking as well? Because that has an impact on where people live or want to live.
Significant shift in buyer preferences within communities to larger homes because of work from home, and also shifts to suburbs and rural areas. It has made a shift, I think about a 38% now out migration from the city of Toronto increase year over year. That's one of the main drivers behind that.
Wow, 38%. That's an incredible statistic. I want to thank Tim Hudak. He is the head of the Ontario Real Estate Association, for being on a most fascinating show. Thank you for being here.
Really great to see you again. Keep up the good work on Boom and Bust. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. I'd like to thank Tim Hudak of the Ontario Real Estate Association again for being on this program. A very interesting show indicating long-term trends, trends that were accentuated by COVID, all impacting affordability of housing, sustainability of the housing market, and where it's going, not only in Toronto, but in more rural and remote areas too. I hope you found it enjoyable. We'll be watching this story. Please keep with us.